The morning that would alter the course of an entire community began quietly, almost unremarkably, with the soft light of early March filtering through a South Carolina sky. It was the morning of Friday, March 3, 1989, in the rural stretch of Berkeley County, known for its quiet roads, spaced-out homes, and the sense of safety that families believed rural life granted them. In one of those homes, a 5-year-old boy named Justin Lee Turner began his day in the same predictable way he always did, unaware that this routine would soon become a haunting final snapshot. Justin, a bright blonde-haired child known for his affectionate personality and gentle disposition, started his morning with a bowl of Cinnamon Crunch cereal. It was simple, familiar, and comforting, the kind of breakfast countless children across the country enjoyed before a school day. He lived with his biological father, Victor Turner, and his stepmother, Pamela Turner, in a house set along Horseshoe Road, not far from the quiet areas near the Cross and Monk's Corner communities. At 5 years old, Justin was enrolled in kindergarten at Whitesville Elementary School, and each morning he followed the same path to catch his school bus. He walked from his home to a neighbor's driveway where multiple children from the area waited together. This routine, repeated day after day, week after week, was well known to the neighbors and to the other children who shared the bus with him. The idea that something could interrupt such a predictable ritual seemed unthinkable. But on that particular morning, something did change. For reasons that were not yet known and would remain the subject of agonizing questions for decades, Justin never arrived at the neighbor's driveway. His absence was noticed almost immediately by the children who typically saw him each morning and by the neighbor who kept an eye on the kids as they waited for the bus. The school bus arrived as usual, the doors opened, and the children climbed aboard. One of the kindergartners later recalled that everyone simply assumed Justin was sick that day, because it did not occur to them, not in that moment, that something sinister could have happened between his doorstep and a neighbor's driveway. When the bus reached Whitesville Elementary School, Justin's classmates disembarked, glancing around for the little boy with the cheerful smile who usually trailed behind them. His absence was noticeable but not alarming. Children get colds, they stay home, and they return the next day with stories about missing school. It was at this point just another assumption, nothing more. But hours later, that quiet assumption shattered. When the afternoon bus left the school to return the children home, the familiar image of Justin's stepmother waiting in the driveway stood out to many of the children as the bus approached the Turner residence. She was waiting the same way she always did, expecting her stepson to descend the bus steps and race toward her. But when the doors opened and each child stepped down, Justin was not among them. He had not been seen at school. He had not been seen boarding the bus that morning, and now he was not stepping off it. In that moment, alarm rippled through the neighborhood in a way that would never be forgotten. Pamela Turner, realizing something was deeply wrong, immediately began asking nearby families if anyone had seen Justin. One neighbor, remembering the sudden concern in the stepmother's voice, later recalled her saying, "He didn't come over, and he wasn't on the bus." The neighbor's child, now grown, described the moment vividly in later interviews. "The first thing we thought was, Justin must be sick. Then me and my brother got home from school at my grandma's, and we were just playing, and his stepmom came over to ask if we had seen him. I guess it was 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon. She asked if he was at school. We said no, he wasn't on the bus. We thought he was home sick. And that's basically when we knew something was wrong, because why would a stepmom come over and ask family members? That's when something didn't feel right." Panic quickly spread through the small rural network of homes. Justin was not the kind of child to wander off. He was not impulsive and did not have a history of leaving home without telling an adult. As more neighbors learned about the missing child, they joined the initial search, combing yards, driveways, and wooded patches of property nearby. Law enforcement was contacted, and Berkeley County deputies James Gaither and Philip Mason responded to the emergency call. Officers immediately began a search of the Turner home, its surrounding property, and the small structures nearby, including a camper that sat a short distance from the house. They moved through rooms, checked the yard, sheds, and outdoor areas thoroughly. At the same time, deputies spread out along Horseshoe Road, examining the route Justin would have walked to reach the neighbor's driveway. No trace of him was found. Within hours, word of the missing boy spread across the county. Local families expressed disbelief. Rural communities often cling to the belief that they are insulated from the dangers of the wider world. Residents asked one another how a 5-year-old child, on a short walk he took every morning, could vanish without anyone seeing or hearing a thing. The terrain around the Turners' home included wooded patches and open fields, and deputies began systematic searches, forming grid patterns and pushing through dense vegetation in hopes that Justin had perhaps wandered off or fallen somewhere. By nightfall, the fear that Justin had been abducted seeped into the investigation. The air was heavy with confusion and dread, and the lack of physical evidence only deepened the mystery. Over the next 2 days, the search for Justin intensified. Community volunteers joined law enforcement. Search and rescue teams arrived, and divers dredged nearby ponds. Officers checked ditches, crawl spaces, abandoned structures, and woodland areas with increasing urgency. Dogs were brought in to track potential scent trails. It seemed impossible that a child could simply disappear in such a short span of time. But as every hour passed, it became increasingly likely that Justin had not wandered off by himself. On Sunday, March 5, 1989, the third day of the search, more than 100 people converged on the Turner property and nearby land. They moved as a coordinated force, driven by a deep hope that the child they had all come to know through news reports would be found alive. The Turners, family members, friends, and neighbors anxiously watched as wave after wave of searchers passed through the area yet again, checking places they had already searched in case anything had been missed. And then, a discovery was made. But it was not made by law enforcement, nor by the volunteer search teams who had spent days scouring the region. It was made by Justin's father, Victor Turner. According to witness accounts and later investigative documents, Victor approached the family camper, a structure that had already been searched by deputies, as well as by at least one neighbor and Justin's grandmother. For reasons still debated to this day, Victor walked directly to a particular storage compartment within the camper. Seconds after entering the camper, he located his son. Witnesses outside heard Victor call out urgently for everyone to stand back, his voice carrying a sharp, distressed command. "Something's in there. Everybody stand back. Everybody stand back." Inside the storage compartment lay the lifeless body of 5-year-old Justin Lee Turner. Shock rippled through the assembled search teams. The discovery raised immediate questions, not only about what had happened to Justin, but how his body could have remained undiscovered despite earlier searches of the same camper. Investigators, neighbors, and even family members struggled to comprehend how a small, thoroughly inspected space could conceal a child's remains for days without detection. Equally disturbing was the condition of Justin's body. Several people, including deputies, later recalled that his body felt unusually cool to the touch, despite the mild temperatures that weekend, sparking speculation that he may have been refrigerated prior to being placed in the camper. Though later medical findings would cast doubt on that theory, the initial impression only added to the sense of mystery. Investigators immediately secured the area, but the presence of numerous people on the property over the past 3 days made it extremely difficult to maintain an uncontaminated crime scene. Evidence could have been compromised, disturbed, or unknowingly destroyed. It was a challenge that would haunt the investigation for decades. The community's devastation was profound. The news that the missing child had been found deceased and under such troubling circumstances sent shockwaves through Berkeley County. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Neighbors who once allowed their kids to play freely outside now kept them close. One local resident expressed the fear shared by many. "My little grandson loves to go across the street and play with the kid over there, and now he's not allowed to. In fact, I don't even want him in the front yard anymore. Not until somebody is caught and charged with this. Even then we won't relax, but maybe it'll ease some of the tension." As the autopsy and criminal investigation began, it became clear that this was not a case of a child wandering off or suffering an accidental injury. Justin had been killed intentionally, and the evidence indicated that he had been harmed not long before his death. These facts would form the foundation of a long and painful search for answers, a search that would persist for more than 3 decades. At this point, suspicion began to shift inward, toward the people closest to Justin. In the days that followed the discovery of Justin's body, the investigation shifted in tone, from frantic searching to the painstaking and often uncomfortable process of determining who was responsible for the death of a 5-year-old boy. While deputies and agents from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division worked to process the camper and collect evidence from the Turner property, the family that had been so central to the search now found themselves at the center of increasingly intense scrutiny. To understand the complexities of this case and why suspicion fell so quickly upon those within Justin's own household, it is necessary to step backward into his family history, a history marked by turbulence, strained relationships, and a custody battle that had shaped much of Justin's young life. Justin had been born in 1983 to his biological parents, Elaine Pace and Victor Turner. Their marriage, which began in January of 1976, had been troubled almost from the start. By the mid-1980s, the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. Arguments, disagreements, and a growing emotional distance pushed the couple into separation and, eventually, divorce. In the aftermath, Victor Turner secured primary custody of their son. Family members who knew Elaine later described her as a devoted mother who fought to maintain a meaningful relationship with Justin despite the custody arrangement. She visited him on weekends, called him daily, and tried to remain present in his life even as the distance between households made everything more complicated. Relatives said she desperately wanted her son back with her, and she was pursuing legal avenues to revisit the custody terms. Because of this ongoing custody tension, Elaine became an early subject of suspicion in the disappearance. Law enforcement had to consider every possibility, including whether she or someone connected to her might have taken Justin. But when deputies looked deeper, the timeline collapsed that theory almost immediately. Elaine and her husband, Russell Pace, were both at work that morning. Neither had left their jobs, and both employers confirmed their presence. Their alibis stood firm. As investigators attempted to question Elaine, she reportedly responded each time with a mixture of fear and frustration, saying, "I do not have my son. Will you please find my son?" Her family later recalled that on the day Justin went missing, her father, Justin's grandfather, was at a relative's home when the phone rang with the news. He immediately left to return to Somerville, bringing a family member with him. They arrived while searches were ongoing and watched as uncertainty turned into panic. One relative later said, "I assume they were thinking it was parental abduction. They called her asking what she had done with Justin. She kept telling them, 'I don't have my son. Will you please find my son?'" With Elaine's alibi confirmed, attention shifted back toward the Turner home, the last known place Justin had been alive. Investigators began analyzing the accounts of that morning, and inconsistencies began to surface. Pamela Turner, Justin's stepmother, stated that Justin had left the house to walk toward the neighbor's driveway while she was in the shower. She said she believed he had caught the bus and gone to school. Her story was presented as simple, straightforward, and unremarkable, but investigators needed to verify every detail. They asked neighbors whether they had seen Justin that morning. No one had. Not a single witness had seen the little boy walking toward the bus stop. No children waiting at the driveway had seen him. No adults had spotted him on the road. For a rural area with typically quiet morning traffic, the absence of any witnesses became a glaring red flag. Attention then shifted to Victor Turner. He claimed he had been at his job as a pipe welder on the morning Justin disappeared. His coworkers did confirm he had been at work that day. But investigators began looking closely at the dynamic within the home, the layout of the property, and the timeline of events, trying to determine whether someone in the household could have harmed Justin before the school day began. Compounding the suspicion was the discovery of Justin's body inside the camper, a structure that investigators were told the Turners were the only ones with keys to access. Though multiple people said they had searched the camper, no one found anything until Victor himself walked inside and located the storage compartment where Justin's remains had been hidden. The swiftness with which Victor found the body raised uncomfortable questions for law enforcement. Deputy Philip Mason, one of the first responders to the house, said he had searched the camper earlier but found nothing. When he later took a polygraph about the search, he failed. This only added to the confusion. as it was unclear whether the failed test reflected dishonesty, faulty memories under stress, or the flawed reliability of polygraphs themselves. Justin's grandmother and a neighbor both insisted they had also checked the camper before the body was discovered. All of this contributed to a bewildering puzzle. If the camper had been searched repeatedly, how could Justin's body appear there only on the third day? As investigators collected evidence from the camper and surrounding structures, they faced a troubling reality. The scene had been heavily compromised. Dozens of people had walked through the property during the search, including law enforcement, family members, neighbors, and volunteers. Anything that might have been left by the perpetrator could have been contaminated. Footprints overlapped, fingerprints smudged. Objects had been moved in good faith by people trying to help. These factors delayed and complicated forensic analysis. The medical examiner's autopsy deepened the complexity of the timeline. Justin was found with food still in his stomach, suggesting he died between mid-morning and early afternoon on the day he disappeared. This pointed investigators away from stranger abduction theories. A person unrelated to the family would have needed to remove the boy from the home, hide him, harm him, and then return his body to the camper on a heavily searched property, all without detection. Criminal psychologists later described such a scenario as highly unlikely. One expert, David A. Caldwell, put it plainly: Justin was almost certainly killed by someone who knew him and understood his routine. Meanwhile, investigators brought Pamela and Victor back in for questioning. Both underwent polygraphs. Both failed. Afterward, they hired an attorney and stopped speaking voluntarily with investigators. Their sudden silence sparked immediate speculation in the media, and Lieutenant Sidney Wren of the Sheriff's Office addressed the public in a cautious tone. When asked whether any evidence suggested an outside intruder, he said, "To my knowledge, there's none." The public began to form its own theories, but investigators wanted concrete answers. Several witnesses reported that Pamela had an argument with Justin on the morning he went missing, contradicting her earlier claim that she had simply been in the shower and unaware of anything unusual. She later admitted that she had given investigators incorrect information about her whereabouts that day. These inconsistencies fueled suspicions. Authorities also determined that the story the Turners initially gave that Justin had gotten on the bus in the morning was false. As one official later stated, he never got on that bus. He never got on that bus because he was dead inside that house. This revelation was a turning point. The jury in the county coroner's inquest recommended that Pamela Turner be arrested for homicide. She was taken into custody without visible emotion. However, when prosecutors reviewed the evidence, they determined it was not strong enough for a conviction. The charges were dropped, leaving the case in a painful limbo. Afterward, both Victor and Pamela Turner, who later changed her name to Megan, left Berkeley County. They had no further contact with the sheriff's office. Years passed. Rumors persisted. The case grew cold. Then, in January of 1991, nearly 2 years after Justin's death, a 6-year-old witness came forward, claiming to have seen Justin's abduction. Investigators pursued this lead intensely, hoping for a breakthrough. But after deeper scrutiny, they determined the child's account was likely influenced by overheard conversations rather than first-hand recollection. The lead collapsed. Still, Justin's mother, Elaine Pace, refused to give up. For 15 years, she fought to keep her son's case from fading into obscurity. She gave interviews, pushed investigators, wrote letters, and pleaded with anyone who would listen. But in 2004, Elaine passed away, never knowing who killed her child. Her husband, Russell, spoke about her final wishes, saying, "I promised my wife before she passed that I would continue the battle. She told me not to give up, keep it in the news, keep fighting for her." With those words, he carried her mission into the years that followed, determined to secure justice, not only for Justin, but for the mother who died waiting for answers. By 2014, Justin's extended family had reignited public interest in the case. They worked with investigative reporters and local media outlets to ensure people did not forget what had happened to the little boy whose smile had once brightened their lives. His cousin, Amy Parsons, became one of the strongest advocates, starting the Justice for Justin Lee Turner page and rallying others to keep the case alive. It would take 30 years before the past finally began to unravel. And when it did, it came from a place no one expected: a cold case team, a new set of forensic tools, and evidence that had been waiting for technology to catch up with it. As the decades progressed, the absence of answers became its own form of torment for those who had loved Justin. The Turner case was whispered about in Berkeley County, discussed in fragments and half-remembered details, and debated by generations who had grown up hearing the story of the 5-year-old boy who vanished along a familiar morning path. Residents remembered the shock of his disappearance, the dread of the search, and the unspeakable sorrow that followed the discovery of his body. Even as time moved on and new families settled into the community, the unsolved nature of the crime lingered as an unresolved wound. The passage of time had another consequence. Technology evolved. Forensic science grew more precise. Techniques that had not existed in the late 1980s became standard in modern investigations. And while the case had gone cold, evidence from the Turner home, the camper, and Justin's clothing had been preserved, protected in storage, waiting for the day when analysis might reveal what early investigators could not. In 2020, more than 3 decades after Justin's murder, the Berkeley County Sheriff's Office launched a renewed effort to breathe life into long-dormant cases. They created a dedicated cold case team composed of 1 full-time investigator and 2 trained volunteers whose sole purpose was to revisit unsolved homicides with new eyes and new tools. Among the 9 cases chosen for re-examination, Justin stood out sharply. It involved a child victim. It involved questions that had never been answered. It involved a community that had never forgotten. Sheriff Dwayne Lewis spoke candidly about the decision to re-examine the Turner case. He explained that modern forensic medicine had advanced significantly since 1989. What had once been impossible was now increasingly feasible. And as he stated publicly, "We have a lot of forensic evidence. We got here because of new technology and forensic medicine. We kept pushing and plugging and pulling to finally get what we needed." Investigators began by re-evaluating the autopsy records, the original crime scene photos, and the evidence stored from the Turner property. They retested fibers, analyzed environmental markers on the boy's clothing, and revisited the condition of the camper and the storage compartment where his body had been found. Forensic experts scrutinized materials that had not yielded conclusive results decades earlier. One of the most striking observations remained unchanged. Justin's clothing, shoes, and body bore no signs of outdoor debris. There were no leaves, no dirt, no pine needles, and no indications that he had ever walked outside on the morning of March 3rd. This aligned with the theory that Justin had never left the home alive. Instead of disappearing along the short route to the bus stop, he had most likely died inside the house, and his body had then been carried to the camper. The forensic team examined fibers found on Justin's neck and clothing. They compared them to fibers recovered from the Turner residence. More advanced analysis tied these fibers specifically to items in the home. This was an important detail because such a connection brought the focus back to the residence and to the people who lived there. The probable cause affidavit laid out a particularly troubling detail. Victor and Pamela, now known as Megan, were, at the time of Justin's death, the only individuals who had access to the camper and the only people with the keys to the compartment where the child's body was discovered. Though the camper had been searched earlier, the placement of Justin's body in an area known to be locked raised the grim possibility that the person responsible was someone with both access and familiarity with its layout. Investigators also re-examined the statements made by Victor on the morning he found the body. According to official reports, he located Justin's remains within mere seconds of stepping into the camper, an action that struck investigators as unusually direct. For someone who was supposedly searching blindly, his path to the compartment where the body lay was almost unnervingly precise. Even decades later, one detail from that morning remained chilling. Victor was overheard asking a law enforcement officer, what would happen if someone within the family had caused harm to the victim? The investigator who recalled the question found it striking, particularly because the inquiry had come at a moment when the shock of locating Justin's body was still fresh. Sheriff Lewis and the cold case team began assembling all of this information meticulously, aligning the old findings with new forensic data. The evidence, both physical and contextual, began forming a cohesive narrative, one that pointed inward rather than outward. The idea of a stranger abductor, already unlikely based on the timeline, geography, and forensic profile, diminished further with each re-examined detail. As the cold case team presented their findings to prosecutors, a clearer picture emerged. Justin had likely been killed inside the home. His body had been moved after his death. The camper had been re-entered after earlier searches. Someone with intimate knowledge of the property had concealed him, and the newly analyzed fiber evidence further tied the crime to the interior of the house. In April of 2021, the cold case team reached what investigators described as a turning point. They identified forensic evidence, linking fibers from the Turner home to the wounds on Justin's neck and the items he had been wearing. This connection gave them the foundation they had lacked in earlier decades. The sheriff publicly acknowledged the significance of the development. "This case is where it is because new technology finally allowed us to see what we couldn't before. We kept pushing. We never stopped pushing." The momentum continued. After months of review, prosecutors determined that the evidence was finally strong enough to move forward. The decades-old case that had once seemed unsolvable was suddenly poised to take a dramatic turn. On Tuesday, January 9, 2024, more than 34 years after the death of 5-year-old Justin Lee Turner, Berkeley County authorities made an announcement that reverberated across the region. Victor Turner and his former wife, now known as Megan Turner, were arrested and charged with the murder of Justin. Both were booked in Lawrence County, where they had been living, and were then transported to the Berkeley County Detention Center to await court appearances. For those who had long believed the truth would never surface, the arrests felt like both a shock and a vindication. Family members of Justin's biological mother, who had fought relentlessly for justice, described the moment as both emotional and surreal. After so many years of unanswered questions, the possibility of closure seemed closer than ever. Yet even with the arrests, the legal process was far from over. The Turners were granted bond in February of 2024, an amount set at $50,000 each. Megan was released on February 8th, and Victor was released the following day. As part of their bond conditions, they were prohibited from contacting members of Justin's maternal family or traveling outside the state. As the case moved into hearings, the defense team adopted a strategy that would soon fuel widespread debate. They argued that a potential serial killer named Richard Mark Evett could have been responsible for Justin's death. They presented this as a new theory and requested additional time for both sides to investigate the possibility. Prosecutors opposed the claim and emphasized the strength of the forensic evidence connecting the crime to the Turner household. But the judge acknowledged the gravity of the information and agreed to postpone a ruling to allow for more investigation. The courtroom atmosphere during this hearing was tense. Even the judge remarked, "This is pretty explosive evidence." And obviously everybody needs time to explore that and digest that and investigate that. At the same time, prosecutors presented another detail that had emerged from the re-examination. A dog leash found in the Turner home might have been used in the strangulation. Defense experts countered that a dog collar could have also been involved, raising questions about the exact mechanism of Justin's death. Still, forensic connections tying fibers from the leash to Justin's neck remained central to the prosecution's argument. For Justin's family, especially those who had kept the fight alive through the years, the legal back and forth did little to dampen their resolve. After decades of waiting, they believed they were closer than ever to securing justice. One family spokesperson said with palpable emotion, "It's hard to believe the person who did this lived their life for 25 years thinking they got away with it. It's mind-boggling." Amy Parsons, who had been 8 years old when Justin died, had dedicated large portions of her adult life to keeping his case in the public eye. She remained firm in her belief that justice would eventually come. She stated, "For 30-something years, you enjoyed your freedom. You did not observe one day behind those prison walls for what you did to Justin. You were supposed to take care of him, love him, and instead you tortured, abused, and murdered your child. It takes a sick individual to do what you did to that baby, and I hope you never see life outside those prison walls." She delivered these words with the conviction of someone who had waited a lifetime to speak them. Behind her advocacy was the memory of her cousin, the little boy whose life had been taken far too soon, and the memory of Justin's mother, Elaine, who had fought tirelessly for justice until the day she died. One relative summarized Elaine's legacy poignantly. "The hardest part is that Justin's mother can't be here to see what she wanted all these years. She wanted justice." While the legal process continued, Justin's memory remained preserved in the community that had searched for him, mourned him, and carried the story forward through generations. More than 200 people had attended his funeral at Somerville Cemetery in Dorchester County, surrounding his small casket with the belongings he had cherished during his brief life. Those images had never faded from the minds of those who were there. Justin's story is one of tragedy, but also of persistence, devotion, and the unrelenting drive of a family who refused to let his case be forgotten. The investigation was entering a new chapter, and with it came renewed hope that the truth, long obscured by time and unanswered questions, would finally be brought fully into the light. As the case re-entered the public eye with the arrests of Victor and Megan Turner in early 2024, people across South Carolina found themselves drawn back into the decades-old story of a child whose life had ended before it had a chance to unfold. The news cycles revisited the facts, the unanswered questions, and the lingering shadows that had surrounded the Turner family for so long. Younger generations who had not been alive in 1989 were introduced to the story through local broadcasts, online articles, and true crime discussions. Those who remembered the original investigation spoke again about the heartbreak that gripped the community at the time. Many of these individuals described the sense of helplessness they felt back then, how the disappearance of a 5-year-old boy shattered the illusion of rural safety, and how the sudden discovery of his body sent shockwaves through the county. Some recalled the moment they learned Justin had been found. Others remembered gathering at church services or community centers, trying to process the horror. Though decades had passed, the impact had never truly faded. With renewed attention came renewed scrutiny of every piece of the case file, every conflicting statement, and every inconsistency that had been debated throughout the years. The Turners' explanations from the original investigation were re-examined under a sharper lens, especially the timeline of the morning Justin disappeared. Investigators once again looked closely at Pamela's claim that Justin left the house while she was showering and that she simply assumed he caught the bus. But now, with more advanced forensic tools, authorities revisited evidence that in earlier years had been too limited to yield meaningful results. Among the most significant findings was the analysis of fibers found on Justin's body, fibers that had always been part of the evidence box but had not been fully understood. Modern technology allowed experts to determine not only that the fibers matched items in the Turner home, but that they were specifically tied to objects Justin would not have come into contact with under normal circumstances on the morning of his disappearance. The cold case investigators also reviewed statements made by neighbors and extended family, some of whom had maintained from the beginning that Justin had never been seen leaving the house that day. These accounts aligned with the forensic finding that the soles of Justin's shoes bore no debris, mud, dust, or outdoor particles. This detail, which had raised suspicion in 1989, now took on even greater significance. If the boy had walked outside, even briefly, some evidence of the outdoors should have adhered to his clothing. Its absence pointed strongly toward an indoor death. Another detail that resurfaced during the renewed investigation was the condition of Justin's body when it was first found. Several witnesses, including early responders, had remarked that his remains felt unusually cold given the mild temperatures of the weekend. This observation had stirred theories that Justin might have been refrigerated after his death. While later autopsy findings did not conclusively confirm refrigeration, the unusual coolness remained an intriguing and unsettled aspect of the case. The cold case team examined this detail once again, though technology was limited in explaining conditions that old. Still, the possibility that Justin's body had been stored before placement in the camper continued to influence investigators' understanding of the timeline. One of the most haunting inconsistencies in the case involved the searches of the camper. Over the years, multiple individuals insisted that the camper had been checked thoroughly before Justin's body was found. Deputies, family members, and neighbors had walked through it, opened compartments, and peered inside cabinets, yet none of them saw the child's body. This led to a persistent question. Was Justin's body placed in the camper after those searches, or had the early searches simply been flawed? This question became even more significant in light of the affidavit stating that only Victor and Megan had keys to the camper. If access was limited, then so too was the pool of individuals who could have entered the compartment where Justin was found. The ability to place him there unnoticed, especially during a period of intense searching, suggested knowledge of the property and the search patterns, something unlikely for an outside offender. Investigators also revisited the peculiar way Victor found the body. According to original accounts, Victor entered the camper and located the exact compartment within seconds. He did not appear to be searching randomly. He did not open multiple doors or crawl through the space in confusion. Instead, he went directly to the storage area where Justin's remains had been hidden. This focused movement struck investigators as more consistent with someone who already knew where the body was, rather than someone making an accidental discovery. Victor's question to law enforcement that same morning added to the unease. His inquiry: what would happen if someone within the family had caused harm to the victim? Stood out as deeply unusual for a parent who had just discovered their child dead under mysterious circumstances. The phrasing raised questions about whether Victor was attempting to gauge potential legal outcomes, perhaps anticipating where the investigation might lead. These details, layered together with the newly reanalyzed fiber evidence, supported the prosecution's argument that the crime had occurred inside the Turner home and that an insider was responsible. As the legal process unfolded in 2024, the court hearings attracted significant attention. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and local residents followed updates closely. The Turners were arraigned in a courtroom filled with both supporters and critics. Members of Justin's biological mother's family attended each hearing, sitting together in quiet solidarity. They had waited for decades to hear Justin's name spoken in a courtroom again in pursuit of justice. As testimony and motions unfolded, the defense introduced an unexpected theory involving a man named Richard Mark Evett, a convicted offender whose name had surfaced in other violent cases. The defense suggested that Evett could have been responsible for Justin's death, presenting this possibility as new evidence. They argued that investigators had not fully considered Evett's potential connection to the region during the time of the crime. Prosecutors challenged the theory, pointing out significant holes. There was no physical evidence tying Evett to the Turner property, no witness placement, and no timeline that explained how he could have entered the home, harmed Justin, and then hidden the body in the camper, all without being seen by neighbors or family members. They emphasized the improbability of a stranger navigating the property's layout, especially knowing precisely where to conceal the body. Still, the defense's claim had enough potential gravity that the judge allowed further investigation. During one hearing, the judge acknowledged the seriousness of the defense's argument, stating, "This is pretty explosive evidence. And, obviously, everybody needs time to explore that, and digest that, and investigate that." The public reaction to the serial killer theory was mixed. Some viewed it as a legitimate question that deserved exploration. Others saw it as a desperate attempt to redirect blame. Amy Parsons, Justin's cousin and one of the most vocal advocates for justice, urged the public to stay focused on the evidence. She stressed that emotions and speculation could cloud judgment, but the physical proof told a story that could not be ignored. While the legal debates continued, investigators maintained their stance that the fiber evidence was one of the strongest components of the case. The fibers from the dog leash found in the house matched those embedded in the marks on Justin's neck. These fibers were also present on his clothing. This overlap strengthened the theory that the murder weapon had come from inside the home and that the assailant had been in close physical proximity to Justin at the time of his death. Defense experts countered that a dog collar might also have been involved, but this argument did not dilute the significance of the fiber match. The prosecution emphasized that the mechanism was less important than the fact that the material used to harm Justin originated within the Turner residence, a detail that further undermined theories involving unknown outside perpetrators. For Justin's family, each advancement in the case stirred a combination of relief and heartache. As new evidence surfaced and old evidence was reframed, they found themselves revisiting memories of the original investigation, the painful years after Elaine's death, and the many times they had feared the case would never be resolved. They felt that the truth had been within reach all along, but had remained obscured by misdirection, distraction, and the limitations of older investigative methods. A relative expressed their grief bluntly. "The hardest part is that Justin's mother isn't here to see this moment. She fought so long, every single day, to find out what happened to her child. She deserved to see justice handed down." The family also spoke about the weight of waiting. Waiting had defined their lives for decades. Waiting for answers, waiting for officials to call with updates, waiting for technology to catch up with evidence, waiting for someone to be held accountable. Now, for the first time, they were waiting with hope rather than despair. As the case progressed through the court system, Berkeley County residents, especially those who had been alive in 1989, reflected on how deeply the tragedy had affected their community. Some recalled the overwhelming turnout at the funeral. More than 200 mourners gathered at Somerville Cemetery in Dorchester County, paying respects to a child whose life had been taken before he even learned to read fully. They remembered the small casket, the personal belongings placed inside, and the palpable sorrow that filled the air. Others remembered the way parents changed their routines after Justin's death. Children were no longer allowed to walk unsupervised, even short distances. Neighbors kept a closer watch. Trust diminished. The sense of rural safety that had once defined the area shifted, replaced with vigilance and caution. In this renewed context, the work of the cold case team took on an even greater significance. Their persistence demonstrated not only investigative commitment, but a recognition of the community's long-standing need for resolution. For families like the Paces and the Parsons, the arrests represented not the end of the journey, but a milestone in a fight that had spanned more than 30 years. The legal proceedings were ongoing. The public watched. The family waited. And the story of Justin Lee Turner, the 5-year-old boy whose disappearance first shocked Berkeley County in 1989, continued to unfold, step by step, through the halls of a courtroom determined to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long. In the months following the arrests of Victor and Megan Turner, the community's attention remained fixed on the unfolding legal drama. Old news articles resurfaced, documentaries revisited the timeline of events, and conversations that had once existed only in private households now echoed across social media, forums, and public discussion groups. People who had once participated in the search for Justin, some now grandparents themselves, found their memories returning with vivid clarity. The emotional weight of the past had never fully left them, and the arrests forced many to confront those buried experiences all over again. With every court hearing, more details emerged about the renewed forensic analysis and how the cold case team pieced together fragments left unresolved for decades. The fiber evidence, in particular, became a focal point of the prosecution's argument. When modern forensic experts compared samples from Justin's clothing and the ligature marks on his neck to materials taken from inside the Turner home, they found compelling matches. These matches were not general similarities, but specific, consistent characteristics that linked the fibers directly to household items owned by Victor and Megan. This evidence suggested that whatever had been used to harm Justin did not come from outside the home. It originated from objects within the walls of the residence where Justin lived. This conclusion carried significant weight in narrowing the pool of possible suspects. Moreover, the cold case team revisited the question of access to the camper, a detail that had troubled investigators since 1989. The camper had been locked, and according to records, only Victor and Megan had keys to it. During the renewed investigation, detectives discovered that when Victor found Justin's body, the camper was not simply entered at random. His pathway inside was purposeful. He did not search quickly or frantically. Instead, he moved directly to the storage compartment where the boy's body was later discovered. This action continued to raise questions, even after all those years. It suggested prior knowledge of where the body was hidden. It contradicted the notion of an accidental discovery made by a grieving father. It suggested, as prosecutors would later argue, an awareness of the camper's contents before the discovery was publicly known. Beyond the physical evidence, the prosecution also presented behavioral patterns that they believed were indicative of guilt. They pointed to inconsistencies in the statements given by both Victor and Megan during the initial investigation in 1989. Pamela, now known as Megan, had claimed to be in the shower when Justin supposedly left for the bus stop. But new witness statements and confrontation of past testimony revealed discrepancies in her story. She later admitted to having an argument with Justin that morning, contradicting her original assertion that she had no interaction with him before he allegedly left the house. Investigators also revisited the emotional reactions, or lack thereof, exhibited by Victor and Megan in the days following Justin's disappearance. At the time, some responders had noted what they felt was unusual emotional distance. During the search, Megan appeared calm, even detached at times, while Victor's demeanor fluctuated unpredictably. Though grief appears differently in individuals and cannot be used alone as a measure of guilt, these behavioral observations became part of the broader mosaic. The prosecution presented a mosaic that suggested the Turners were not merely grieving parents, but individuals withholding vital truth. As investigators prepared for the possibility of a forthcoming trial, the defense's strategy continued to hinge on introducing doubt through the potential involvement of Richard Mark Evatt. They argued that Evatt's criminal history and presence in the region during the late 1980s could not be dismissed. But prosecutors countered by emphasizing the absence of any physical evidence tying Evatt to the Turner property. No fingerprints, no fibers, no eyewitness accounts, and no verified timeline placed him at or near the home around the time of Justin's death. The defense attempted to bolster their new theory by invoking the fear and shock the community had experienced at the time. They implied that a killer could have moved undetected through the rural area, but the prosecution pointed out that whoever had harmed Justin would have needed intimate familiarity with the Turner property, specifically the locked camper and its layout. For a stranger to accomplish this without being noticed by neighbors, family members, or animals in the area would have required an extraordinary level of stealth and luck. This scenario, prosecutors argued, bordered on implausibility. The discussion surrounding the dog leash found in the Turner home further strengthened the prosecution's case. The leash, discovered during the renewed investigation, contained fibers consistent with those embedded in Justin's neck and clothing, while the defense suggested that a dog collar might also have been involved, casting some doubt on the exact mechanism of strangulation. Prosecutors maintained that the presence of matching fibers alone constituted strong evidence of a link between the child's injuries and objects within the home. For many observers, this evidence was compelling enough to raise serious questions about the Turners' innocence. For others, especially those who believed in the principle of innocent until proven guilty, the unfolding case was a reminder of the importance of thorough and careful legal proceedings. It was crucial that the case be handled with precision, especially after so many years. Meanwhile, Justin's family continued to attend hearings and court sessions with quiet determination. Their presence became a powerful symbol of endurance. After more than 3 decades, they were still there, still fighting for the truth, still holding the system accountable, still advocating for the little boy whose life had been stolen. During interviews, they reflected on how deeply Justin had been loved. Despite his young age, he had left an indelible mark on those who knew him. His grandmother remembered his smile and how he loved playing outside, running with the neighborhood children, and helping with small chores around the house. His cousins remembered his curiosity, his laughter, and his habit of following older relatives around, wanting to be included in everything they did. These memories served as emotional anchors for the family. In their advocacy, they spoke often not just of the tragedy, but of the innocence that had been lost. Justin had been a child who trusted the adults in his life. He depended on them for safety, stability, and care. When those bonds were broken in the most devastating way, the impact radiated outward, affecting multiple generations. Amy Parsons, who had become the family's primary spokesperson, carried the weight of this legacy in her statements. She reminded the public that justice was not simply about satisfying curiosity or resolving a long-standing mystery. It was about honoring a child whose life was cut short and about holding accountable those who failed him in the most profound way. Her words often resonated deeply. Justin was supposed to be protected. He was supposed to be safe in his own home. What happened to him was unimaginable. And for decades, the people who loved him most had to live without answers. That's why we are here. That's why we will keep coming back until the truth is fully exposed. As the legal case continued inching forward, investigators remained cautious. Despite the arrests, they understood that the defense's serial killer theory had introduced a new dimension that needed to be thoroughly addressed. They had to dismantle the defense's argument systematically to ensure the case did not unravel later. Prosecutors spent time analyzing Evatt's history, movements, and documented criminal behavior, ensuring that nothing was left unchecked. Behind the scenes, forensic specialists continued re-examining the fiber evidence. In some cases, they performed repeat analyses to confirm consistency. Every test had to withstand scrutiny from both sides in court. The stakes were high. A mistake could jeopardize the entire case. As the community anticipated the next stages of the legal proceedings, they reflected once more on the pain of the original tragedy. Many remembered how the search had unfolded in 1989. The frantic calls, the coordinated search teams, the prayers whispered at kitchen tables and church pews, the sense of unity that had formed in the face of fear. They remembered the moment the search turned from hope to heartbreak, and the way the community had grieved collectively. Now, decades later, that same community once again held its breath, hopeful that the truth long buried beneath confusion and doubt would finally emerge. Justin's legacy had become more than the story of a crime. It had become a testament to the enduring power of love, memory, and resilience. And as the legal process slowly continued, the promise of justice, long delayed, seemed within reach at last. As the months unfolded, the Turner case occupied a space between the past and the present, pulling together threads that had frayed over the decades. What had once been a community's desperate search for a missing child had evolved into a complex legal battle played out under the scrutiny of modern forensic science and the weight of accumulated grief. Each new hearing brought fresh attention, each new filing stirred renewed emotions, and each new revelation reminded everyone involved how far-reaching the consequences of a single violent act could be. The cold case team's work remained central to the prosecution's strategy. Investigators who had joined the case decades after Justin's death approached the evidence without the cloud of old assumptions that had hovered over the original investigation. They worked methodically, questioning what earlier investigators could not question, and performing forensic tests that earlier investigators could not perform. Their work represented the intersection of persistence and progress, persistence from the family and progress from scientific advancement. One of the elements that caught renewed focus was the timeline of the morning Justin disappeared. In the original investigation, much of the story had rested on the assumption that Justin left the house around the same time he did every other school day. Pamela Turner had said she believed he walked to the neighbor's driveway while she was showering. That simple statement had shaped the early search strategy, leading deputies to focus heavily on the route Justin would have taken to the bus stop. However, the cold case team's reconstruction of the timeline did not support this version of events. Based on witness statements from neighbors, forensic analysis of Justin's clothing, and the lack of any confirming sightings, investigators concluded that Justin had almost certainly never left the house alive. This conclusion aligned with the evidence that his clothing bore no outdoor residue, a detail that had always puzzled early responders but now took on renewed significance. Forensic experts revisited every photograph, every microscopic sample, every trace collected in 1989. They examined the soles of Justin's shoes under high-powered magnification, looking for particles that might have adhered even if the ground had been dry. But there were none. This absence told a story more clearly than words. Justin had not walked outside. He had not left the safety of his home. His disappearance had not occurred on the road to the bus stop. These findings shifted the focus inward once again. Investigators re-examined the interior of the Turner home, analyzing the layout of the rooms, the distance between the kitchen and the bathroom, and the spaces where a child could have been harmed without detection. They also revisited the behavior of the adults in the home that morning. Had anyone heard a disturbance? Had any unusual noises been reported by neighbors? Had anyone noticed the Turners behaving in a way that indicated distress or deception? Interviews from the original case suggested that friends, co-workers, and neighbors had not noticed anything unusual about Victor's behavior on the day Justin disappeared. He had gone to work as scheduled, and while some later described him as appearing tense or distracted, none witnessed anything that stood out as overtly suspicious. But decades later, investigators questioned whether this was evidence of innocence or simply evidence of practiced composure. A recurring question emerged. If Justin died inside the home, how had Victor been able to carry on his workday without exhibiting signs of alarm? And if Pamela discovered Justin was missing when the bus returned in the afternoon, how had she not noticed earlier that he never actually left the house? These questions remained central as prosecutors built their case. They pointed out that the Turners had provided inconsistent statements over time, inconsistencies that grew more noticeable when the timeline was compared with forensic findings. The defense argued that memory can falter over decades and that inconsistencies did not necessarily indicate guilt. But prosecutors emphasized that the contradictions began on the very day Justin disappeared, long before memory decay could explain them. In addition to the timeline and fiber evidence, investigators revisited what had long been one of the most perplexing elements of the case: the search of the camper. The fact that multiple individuals claimed to have searched the camper before Justin's body was discovered raised a chilling possibility that the body had been placed there after the initial searches occurred. Such a maneuver would require opportunity, access to the camper's locked compartments, and awareness of the search patterns unfolding on the property. For prosecutors, this theory explained why Victor located Justin's body so quickly on the third day of searching. If he had placed the body there or had prior knowledge of its placement, his swift discovery was easily understood. But if he had not been involved, then how had he gone directly to the compartment without hesitation? Investigators examined this detail closely, comparing the actions of other searchers with Victor's movements. When deputies and volunteers searched the camper earlier, they appeared methodical but hurried. Searchers moved through compartments quickly, sometimes with limited visibility due to dim lighting and cramped space. Investigators acknowledged that in high-stress searches, oversights can occur. Even so, the probability that multiple adults, including trained deputies, overlooked the body of a child in a small, confined space remained statistically low. And that raised another question. If the body had been placed in the camper after the searches, then when did that occur? Who had access? Who had motive? Who was present during the periods when the property was unsupervised? As the cold case team pieced together these elements, another troubling detail emerged: the question Victor asked a deputy on the morning of the discovery. Witnesses recalled hearing him ask what would happen if someone in the family had caused harm to the child. Investigators in 2024 found the timing of this question deeply suspicious. What parent, moments after finding their deceased child, would raise such a hypothetical? While grief can produce unusual reactions, many investigators believed the question reflected anticipatory anxiety rather than shock. It seemed to indicate that Victor was contemplating possible legal consequences rather than grappling with the raw trauma of the moment. Whether this indicated guilt or an unusual emotional response became a point of contention in courtroom arguments. As the cold case evidence grew stronger, the arrest warrants for Victor and Megan Turner were prepared. The arrests in January 2024 were conducted carefully, with authorities aware that this case had been watched closely by the public for more than 34 years. When the news broke, local media outlets reported it as a major development, reigniting conversations about the case in living rooms, workplaces, and community gatherings. In interviews following the arrests, Sheriff Lewis emphasized that the breakthrough had come from modern forensic techniques that had not existed in the late 1980s. He praised the cold case team for its persistence and expressed sympathy for the family that had waited decades for answers. His message was straightforward. New science had brought new clarity, and justice, though delayed, could finally move forward. Meanwhile, the family of Justin's biological mother responded to the arrests with measured relief. They had lived through 35 years of unanswered questions. For them, the news did not bring closure, not yet, but it brought something that had eluded them for decades: progress. Amy Parsons, who had dedicated so much of her adult life to seeking justice for Justin, spoke about her cousin with a mixture of sorrow and determination. She described him as a kind, curious child whose life had been filled with potential. She spoke of his mother's love and the agony Elaine endured for 15 years before her death. And she expressed her hope that the full truth would finally emerge in court, allowing Justin's memory to be honored with accountability. Even as the defense continued to push its alternative theory involving Richard Mark Evatt, prosecutors remained confident in the strength of their evidence. They emphasized that the fibers found on Justin's body told a story. So did the lack of outdoor debris. So did the locked camper and the limited access. So did the rapid discovery of the body by Victor. And so did the inconsistencies in the Turner's statements. Each piece of evidence, taken alone, might have been explainable. But together, prosecutors argued, the pieces formed a coherent narrative. That narrative, they said, pointed to the individuals inside the Turner home. With the court hearings ongoing and both sides preparing for a potential trial, the community waited once again, not for a missing child this time, but for answers and accountability. The air of anticipation was heavy, shaped by decades of unresolved pain. Justin's story had become a reminder of the fragility of trust, the importance of forensic advancement, and the undeniable determination of a family who refused to let their truth be buried in time. And as the case moved forward, it became increasingly clear that the long-awaited reckoning was approaching. In the slow churn of the justice system, months passed with the steady rhythm of filings, hearings, motions, and procedural steps. Cases as old as Justin's require patience, careful reconstruction, and a methodical approach, especially when both sides wield arguments built on decades of accumulated history. For the investigators, prosecutors, and specialists involved, the Turner case had become a dense puzzle, one requiring precision and resilience. For the family, however, each delay carried emotional weight. They had learned, over decades of disappointment, to brace themselves against the unpredictability of the process. Yet despite the waiting, there was a growing sense that the direction of the case had shifted permanently. Unlike the early 90s, when charges against Pamela were dropped and the case seemed to collapse under the weight of insufficient evidence, the situation in 2024 was different. This time, the evidence was stronger, the technology more advanced, and the foundation of the case more stable. For many, it felt as though the tide had finally turned. Among the many revisited elements of the investigation, one of the most crucial was the question of why Justin's body had gone undiscovered during the early searches. In 1989, multiple deputies and volunteers insisted they had inspected the camper. Some opened cabinet doors, others checked under cushions and inside storage compartments. And yet, Justin's body remained unfound until Victor entered on the third day. Cold case investigators re-examined the search logs, notes, and statements from those who had participated. They found inconsistencies, not uncommon in chaotic searches, but noticed a pattern. Individuals who had searched the camper described the interior as cluttered, dimly lit, and partially obstructed by stored items. Searching such a space required time, focused attention, and familiarity with the layout. However, even considering the less-than-ideal conditions, investigators found it difficult to reconcile how so many people could have missed the body of a child. The compartment where Justin was found was not hidden by any complex mechanism. It was a known structural feature of the camper, accessible through a door that could be opened without special tools. This raised a possibility investigators had long avoided acknowledging in the early stages of the original case. The body may not have been there during the first searches. If true, this would mean that Justin's body had been moved, placed into the camper at a time when the search efforts were still underway. Such an action required not only access to the camper, but also an understanding of the search patterns, gaps in supervision, and opportunities created when deputies and volunteers rotated through the property. It also required familiarity with the property itself, something an outside perpetrator was unlikely to possess. The idea that the body had been placed after the initial searches aligned with several key points in the renewed investigation: the locked camper that only Victor and Megan had keys to, the absence of outdoor debris on Justin's clothing, the fiber evidence linking the Turner home to the victim, and Victor's rapid discovery of the body. Investigators also scrutinized the possibility of refrigeration. The unusual coolness of Justin's remains, noted by early responders, had prompted speculation that the body had been stored in a cold environment between the time of death and placement in the camper. While the autopsy did not conclusively confirm this theory, forensic experts revisited the question during the cold case review. They examined temperature records, environmental conditions, and timeline estimates. They reviewed photographs taken shortly after the discovery. Though definitive proof of refrigeration remained elusive, investigators could not dismiss the possibility entirely. For some, the theory explained both the coolness of the body and the lack of decomposition expected after 2 days in mild temperatures. If Justin had been stored somewhere cold before being placed in the camper, it would have required access to a freezer or refrigerated space, once again pointing toward familiarity with the property. Another significant factor revisited in the renewed investigation was Pamela's behavior in the hours following Justin's disappearance. Witnesses from 1989, including neighbors and extended family members, recalled that Pamela's response to Justin's absence was oddly delayed. While she expressed concern when the bus returned in the afternoon and Justin did not get off, her earlier hours of the day when she believed he had gone to school raised questions in hindsight. Prosecutors examined her statement that she had showered that morning while Justin prepared for school. They contrasted this with accounts that placed her in a different part of the house at that time. Investigators discovered that in the years since the original investigation, Pamela had admitted to arguing with Justin that morning, an admission that contradicted her initial claims. This shift in narrative became a pillar of the prosecutor's argument. They pointed out that changing details are often red flags in criminal investigations. While memory can deteriorate, changes in fundamental stories often indicate an attempt to reshape events. The defense countered by emphasizing the trauma and stress of the situation, arguing that memories can shift under emotional strain. They also pointed out that many years had passed since the events of 1989, and that details naturally evolve over time. But the prosecution argued that the inconsistencies had begun not years later, but immediately on the very day Justin disappeared. This distinction mattered deeply. Another focal point in the legal proceedings involved Victor's behavior during the search period. Co-workers who interacted with him on the day of Justin's disappearance described him as present but somewhat distracted. Some said he seemed anxious, though none thought his behavior indicated awareness of a tragedy at home. Investigators considered whether a person who had harmed their child could go to work as though nothing had happened. Psychologists consulted in the cold case review suggested that individuals can compartmentalize extreme situations or create routines to mask their involvement. In some cases, perpetrators attempt to craft alibis by participating in normal activities. These psychological analyses did not serve as definitive proof of guilt, but offered context for interpreting Victor's workday behavior. The defense, however, used these same details to argue that Victor's ability to function at work demonstrated innocence rather than guilt. They suggested that no parent capable of harming a child could maintain such composure, and that his presence at work supported the theory that someone else was responsible. Yet it was the moment of discovery, the instant when Victor entered the camper and found Justin's body, that prosecutors returned to repeatedly. The cold case team found this moment deeply suspicious. According to witness statements, Victor entered the camper with purpose, moved directly to the compartment, and called out almost immediately. Investigators believed this behavior indicated prior knowledge. They also considered Victor's question to law enforcement immediately after discovering the body. What would happen if someone within the family had caused harm to the victim? For investigators in 2024, this question appeared anticipatory, almost preemptive. It suggested, to some, an individual attempting to understand legal consequences rather than processing the immediate emotional shock of finding a deceased child. Prosecutors included this detail in their filings, arguing that such a question reflected consciousness of guilt. The defense countered by arguing that people say unusual things under extreme emotional distress. They proposed that Victor was overwhelmed and asked the question out of confusion and fear. But prosecutors remained firm that the question was not typical of a parent discovering their child's death under mysterious circumstances. It was, in their view, an indicator that Victor already understood the implications of the moment. Meanwhile, as the case unfolded in the present day, the family of Justin's biological mother continued to advocate forcefully. They attended hearings, spoke with reporters, and met regularly with investigators to stay informed. Their dedication to Justin had become emblematic of the case itself, a representation of unwavering love and determination. During interviews, Amy Parsons repeatedly emphasized that their fight was never fueled by hatred, but by justice. She spoke of the decades of grief endured by her family, especially by Elaine, Justin's mother, who had lived with the loss for 15 years before passing away. Amy often referenced her cousin's memory as a guiding force behind her advocacy, describing the joy he brought to the family and the innocence that had been stolen from him. She said, "We promised Justin that we would never stop fighting for him, and we promised his mother the same. We are keeping both of those promises." Support for the family grew in the community as more residents revisited their memories of Justin. Some spoke of how they joined the original search in 1989, walking through fields, woods, and ditches alongside neighbors and deputies. Others recalled attending Justin's funeral at Somerville Cemetery, and the overwhelming grief that permeated the service. For many, the arrest of the Turners brought back those memories, painful reminders of a child whose life was cut tragically short. The renewed public interest also prompted journalists and true crime researchers to examine the case more deeply. Several media outlets revisited the events of 1989, interviewing key figures and providing detailed timelines of the investigation. The case resurfaced in online communities where amateur sleuths debated theories and analyzed evidence. While some found the defense's serial killer theory worth exploring, most discussions centered on the fiber evidence and the timeline reconstruction that pointed to the Turner home as the primary crime scene. The lack of outdoor debris on Justin's clothing, the locked camper, the inconsistencies in the Turner statements, and the forensic matches formed a compelling pattern. As the legal system continued its slow march toward trial, one thing became clear. After decades of uncertainty, the Turner case was moving toward a resolution, one that many believed had been years overdue. For the family, the possibility of justice brought both relief and renewed sorrow. They understood that no verdict could bring Justin back. No sentence could erase the pain of the last 35 years. But accountability mattered. Truth mattered. Closure, or as close to closure as one can find in such cases, mattered. Justin's story, once a devastating tragedy buried in time, had re-emerged. And this time, it was being confronted with the full weight of modern science, dedicated investigators, and the unyielding determination of a family who refused to forget. In the slow churn of the justice system, months passed with the steady rhythm of filings, hearings, motions, and procedural steps. Cases as old as Justin's require patience, careful reconstruction, and a methodical approach, especially when both sides wield arguments built on decades of accumulated history. For the investigators, prosecutors, and specialists involved, the Turner case had become a dense puzzle, one requiring precision and resilience. For the family, however, each delay carried emotional weight. They had learned, over decades of disappointment, to brace themselves against the unpredictability of the process. Yet despite the waiting, there was a growing sense that the direction of the case had shifted permanently. Unlike the early 90s, when charges against Pamela were dropped and the case seemed to collapse under the weight of insufficient evidence, the situation in 2024 was different. This time, the evidence was stronger, the technology more advanced, and the foundation of the case more stable. For many, it felt as though the tide had finally turned. Among the many revisited elements of the investigation, one of the most crucial was the question of why Justin's body had gone undiscovered during the early searches. In 1989, multiple deputies and volunteers insisted they had inspected the camper. Some opened cabinet doors, others checked under cushions and inside storage compartments. And yet, Justin's body remained unfound until Victor entered on the third day. Cold case investigators re-examined the search logs, notes, and statements from those who had participated. They found inconsistencies not uncommon in chaotic searches, but noticed a pattern. Individuals who had searched the camper described the interior as cluttered, dimly lit, and partially obstructed by stored items. Searching such a space required time, focused attention, and familiarity with the layout. However, even considering the less than ideal conditions, investigators found it difficult to reconcile how so many people could have missed the body of a child. The compartment where Justin was found was not hidden by any complex mechanism. It was a known structural feature of the camper, accessible through a door that could be opened without special tools. This raised a possibility investigators had long avoided acknowledging in the early stages of the original case. The body may not have been there during the first searches. If true, this would mean that Justin's body had been moved, placed into the camper at a time when the search efforts were still underway. Such an action required not only access to the camper but also an understanding of the search patterns, gaps in supervision, and opportunities created when deputies and volunteers rotated through the property. It also required familiarity with the property itself, something an outside perpetrator was unlikely to possess. The idea that the body had been placed after the initial searches aligned with several key points in the renewed investigation. The locked camper that only Victor and Megan had keys to, the absence of outdoor debris on Justin's clothing, the fiber evidence linking the Turner home to the victim, and Victor's rapid discovery of the body. Investigators also scrutinized the possibility of refrigeration. The unusual coolness of Justin's remains, noted by early responders, had prompted speculation that the body had been stored in a cold environment between the time of death and placement in the camper. While the autopsy did not conclusively confirm this theory, forensic experts revisited the question during the cold case review. They examined temperature records, environmental conditions, and timeline estimates. They reviewed photographs taken shortly after the discovery. Though definitive proof of refrigeration remained elusive, investigators could not dismiss the possibility entirely. For some, the theory explained both the coolness of the body and the lack of decomposition expected after 2 days in mild temperatures. If Justin had been stored somewhere cold before being placed in the camper, it would have required access to a freezer or refrigerated space, once again pointing toward familiarity with the property. Another significant factor revisited in the renewed investigation was Pamela's behavior in the hours following Justin's disappearance. Witnesses from 1989, including neighbors and extended family members, recalled that Pamela's response to Justin's absence was oddly delayed. While she expressed concern when the bus returned in the afternoon and Justin did not get off, her earlier hours of the day when she believed he had gone to school raised questions in hindsight. Prosecutors examined her statement that she had showered that morning while Justin prepared for school. They contrasted this with accounts that placed her in a different part of the house at that time. Investigators discovered that in the years since the original investigation, Pamela had admitted to arguing with Justin that morning, an admission that contradicted her initial claims. This shift in narrative became a pillar of the prosecutor's argument. They pointed out that changing details are often red flags in criminal investigations. While memory can deteriorate, changes in fundamental stories often indicate an attempt to reshape events. The defense countered by emphasizing the trauma and stress of the situation, arguing that memories can shift under emotional strain. They also pointed out that many years had passed since the events of 1989 and that details naturally evolve over time. But the prosecution argued that the inconsistencies had begun not years later, but immediately on the very day Justin disappeared. This distinction mattered deeply. Another focal point in the legal proceedings involved Victor's behavior during the search period. Co-workers who interacted with him on the day of Justin's disappearance described him as present but somewhat distracted. Some said he seemed anxious, though none thought his behavior indicated awareness of a tragedy at home. Investigators considered whether a person who had harmed their child could go to work as though nothing had happened. Psychologists consulted in the cold case review suggested that individuals can compartmentalize extreme situations or create routines to mask their involvement. In some cases, perpetrators attempt to craft alibis by participating in normal activities. These psychological analyses did not serve as definitive proof of guilt, but offered context for interpreting Victor's workday behavior. The defense, however, used these same details to argue that Victor's ability to function at work demonstrated innocence rather than guilt. They suggested that no parent capable of harming a child could maintain such composure, and that his presence at work supported the theory that someone else was responsible. Yet it was the moment of discovery, the instant when Victor entered the camper and found Justin's body, that prosecutors returned to repeatedly. The cold case team found this moment deeply suspicious. According to witness statements, Victor entered the camper with purpose, moved directly to the compartment, and called out almost immediately. Investigators believed this behavior indicated prior knowledge. They also considered Victor's question to law enforcement immediately after discovering the body. What would happen if someone within the family had caused harm to the victim? For investigators in 2024, this question appeared anticipatory, almost preemptive. It suggested, to some, an individual attempting to understand legal consequences rather than processing the immediate emotional shock of finding a deceased child. Prosecutors included this detail in their filings, arguing that such a question reflected consciousness of guilt. The defense countered by arguing that people say unusual things under extreme emotional distress. They proposed that Victor was overwhelmed and asked the question out of confusion and fear. But prosecutors remained firm that the question was not typical of a parent discovering their child's death under mysterious circumstances. It was, in their view, an indicator that Victor already understood the implications of the moment. Meanwhile, As the case unfolded in the present day, the family of Justin's biological mother continued to advocate forcefully. They attended hearings, spoke with reporters, and met regularly with investigators to stay informed. Their dedication to Justin had become emblematic of the case itself, a representation of unwavering love and determination. During interviews, Amy Parsons repeatedly emphasized that their fight was never fueled by hatred but by justice. She spoke of the decades of grief endured by her family, especially by Elaine, Justin's mother, who had lived with the loss for 15 years before passing away. Amy often referenced her cousin's memory as a guiding force behind her advocacy, describing the joy he brought to the family and the innocence that had been stolen from him. She said, "We promised Justin that we would never stop fighting for him, and we promised his mother the same. We are keeping both of those promises." Support for the family grew in the community as more residents revisited their memories of Justin. Some spoke of how they joined the original search in 1989, walking through fields, woods, and ditches alongside neighbors and deputies. Others recalled attending Justin's funeral at Somerville Cemetery and the overwhelming grief that permeated the service. For many, the arrest of the Turners brought back those memories, painful reminders of a child whose life was cut tragically short. The renewed public interest also prompted journalists and true crime researchers to examine the case more deeply. Several media outlets revisited the events of 1989, interviewing key figures and providing detailed timelines of the investigation. The case resurfaced in online communities where amateur sleuths debated theories and analyzed evidence. While some found the defense's serial killer theory worth exploring, most discussions centered on the fiber evidence and the timeline reconstruction that pointed to the Turner home as the primary crime scene. The lack of outdoor debris on Justin's clothing, the locked camper, the inconsistencies in the Turner's statements, and the forensic matches formed a compelling pattern. As the legal system continued its slow march toward trial, one thing became clear. After decades of uncertainty, the Turner case was moving toward a resolution, one that many believed had been years overdue. For the family, the possibility of justice brought both relief and renewed sorrow. They understood that no verdict could bring Justin back. No sentence could erase the pain of the last 35 years. But accountability mattered. Truth mattered. Closure, or as close to closure as one can find in such cases, mattered. Justin's story, once a devastating tragedy buried in time, had re-emerged. And this time, it was being confronted with the full weight of modern science, dedicated investigators, and the unyielding determination of a family who refused to forget. As the Turner case advanced into deeper stages of legal evaluation, the courtroom became a stage not merely for the prosecution and defense, but for the layers of history that had built up over more than 3 decades. Each hearing brought the past into the present, compelling everyone involved to confront once again the morning of Friday, March 3, 1989. The story that had begun with a missing child poster now unfolded in the solemn language of affidavits, sworn testimony, forensic reports, and legal argumentation. All the while, the memory of a 5-year-old boy lingered like a quiet echo over every word spoken. In the renewed legal battle, the state's case rested heavily on forensic reanalysis, timeline reconstruction, and behavioral assessment. The defense's strategy, by contrast, leaned on introducing doubt about the forensic findings, doubt about interpretations of past behavior, and doubt about the assumption that the crime must have been committed by someone within the Turner household. One of the most heavily scrutinized components of the defense's argument involved the potential involvement of Richard Mark Evatt, the man they suggested could have been a serial offender active in the region during the time of Justin's death. They presented details about Evatt's criminal background, emphasizing that his history involved violent offenses. They argued that his profile could align with the brutality of Justin's murder. But prosecutors countered these claims with methodical precision. They explained that while Evatt's criminal record was indeed alarming, nothing in his known patterns or geographic presence connected him to the Turner case. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no fiber matches, no DNA markers, and no witness statements linking him to the Turner residence. Most importantly, his method of offending, as documented in other cases, did not match the circumstances surrounding Justin's death. Prosecutors also emphasized that stranger abductions, particularly of very young children, follow distinct patterns involving speed, seclusion, and opportunity. In rural communities, such offenders typically do not target homes where adults are present, nor do they move bodies to secondary locations like campers located on private property. The risk of being seen, confronted, or caught is far too high. The Turner property, with its open yard, visible structures, and multiple adults present in the area during the morning hours, was not an ideal environment for a stranger to approach undetected. Additionally, the prosecution pointed out that the idea of a stranger stealthily entering the Turner home, harming Justin without detection, removing his body, and then later returning to place his remains inside a locked camper, all while a large-scale search was underway, strained credulity to the point of impossibility. The behavior required to orchestrate such a crime would be extraordinarily complex, involving knowledge of the property layout, an understanding of the search patterns, and an ability to evade attention during a highly emotional and chaotic period. The cold case team strengthened this argument by revisiting detailed maps, diagrams, and documents from the original investigation. They reconstructed the search grids, analyzed the spacing of homes, and plotted out the visibility lines from neighboring properties. Through this reconstruction, investigators demonstrated how unlikely it would have been for a stranger to approach the Turner property without being noticed. Even after presenting these points, prosecutors did not rely solely on implausibility. They focused firmly on the physical evidence found on Justin's body, evidence that told a different story, one rooted in familiarity. The fibers embedded in the ligature marks and clinging to Justin's clothing spoke volumes. These fibers, matched to items within the Turner home, could not be explained away by theories involving unknown assailants. Forensic experts were called to testify about the microscopic characteristics of the fibers. They described in technical detail how fiber composition is analyzed, how dyes are evaluated, how thread patterns are compared, and how statistical probabilities are calculated. They explained that fiber analysis is not a vague or subjective process. It is grounded in scientific methodology that can withstand courtroom scrutiny when conducted properly. They noted that the fibers found on Justin's body reflected a high degree of similarity to household materials owned by the Turners, and that these similarities were not incidental. While the defense attempted to challenge the validity of fiber analysis, prosecutors emphasized one critical point. Even if the exact mechanism of strangulation could not be determined conclusively whether it involved a leash, a collar, or another object, the materials used originated from within the Turner residence. This fact, they argued, remained undeniable. The prosecution also highlighted that the fiber evidence was consistent with the broader pattern of findings from the renewed investigation. Justin's clothing showed no signs of having been outside. His shoes held no dirt or debris. His body showed no signs that he had walked to the bus stop. And the camper, where his remains were discovered, was locked accessible only to Victor and Megan. During hearings, investigators and prosecutors reiterated the significance of the locked camper. They reminded the court that this detail had been known from the beginning, but had not carried the same weight it did now, in light of the reanalyzed forensic evidence. If Justin never left the home alive, and his body was later found in a locked structure, then the person responsible must have had access to both the home and the camper. The defense attempted to counter by suggesting that the camper might have been left unlocked at times, or that keys could have been misplaced or borrowed without the Turners' knowledge. But these arguments lacked corroborating evidence. Every statement from neighbors and extended family members indicated that the camper was generally kept locked. Victor himself had acknowledged this during the original investigation. As the prosecution built their case line by line, they returned often to the most haunting moment of the early investigation: Victor's rapid discovery of Justin's body. The cold case team argued that this detail, when combined with the fiber evidence and timeline reconstruction, painted a deeply troubling picture. For investigators, the speed of Victor's discovery was simply too quick, too targeted, and too purposeful to be viewed as mere coincidence. Another detail that gained renewed attention was Victor's demeanor immediately after finding Justin. Witness statements from 1989 indicated that Victor, while certainly shocked, did not display the level of emotional collapse many expected. Instead, he was described as tense, focused, and almost procedural, While emotional responses vary greatly, the cold case team viewed this behavior as potentially significant when considered alongside his earlier question about family involvement. Investigators also looked closely at the relationship dynamics within the Turner home. Testimonies from extended family members over the years suggested tension between Pamela and Justin, and noted that the household faced stressors related to finances, custody disputes, and internal conflict. While these stressors did not constitute evidence of guilt, they offered context that could help explain motivations or circumstances surrounding the crime. Amid these legal and forensic developments, the emotional toll on Justin's extended family deepened. They attended every proceeding, sitting quietly in the courtroom, often holding hands or clutching small mementos that reminded them of Justin. Many wore pins or wristbands bearing his name. Their presence was a visible reminder of the real child at the center of the case, the 5-year-old boy whose life had been defined not by his death, but by his innocence, his smile, and the love his family bore for him. In interviews with local media, family members spoke of the bittersweet nature of the legal progress. They were grateful that the case was finally moving forward, but they were also painfully aware of everything time had taken from them. Years of unanswered questions, years of grief that compounded through every important date, and the absence of Elaine, Justin's mother, who had fought for justice until her final days. One relative said, "For decades, we lived with uncertainty. We lived with questions that never stopped hurting. Now that answers are finally coming, the pain is still there, but at least now we are facing the truth." Their statements resonated deeply within the community. For many residents, the case had become not just a tragic event, but part of the collective memory of Berkeley County. It symbolized the vulnerability of children, the fallibility of early investigations, and the necessity of perseverance. It also became a testament to how deeply one child could touch the lives of thousands. As the case continued to progress, both sides prepared for the possibility of a trial that would attempt to unravel a story rooted in tragedy, surrounded by mystery, and weighed down by more than 3 decades of waiting. But even as legal strategies unfolded and evidence was debated, the essence of the case remained unchanged. It was about Justin, a small boy whose life should have been simple and full of promise. A boy who loved cereal in the mornings, who smiled brightly, who trusted the adults around him, and whose life was stolen in a moment of unimaginable betrayal. The truth was coming into focus, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. In the long arc of criminal investigations, time can either obscure the truth or reveal it. In the Turner case, time did both. It clouded memories, complicated recollections, and introduced decades of uncertainty. Yet it also ushered in new science, new perspectives, and new determination. By the time the case reached its modern chapter, the accumulation of evidence, forensic reanalysis, and historical context had formed a story that could no longer be ignored. As the prosecution prepared to bring their findings before a jury, they knew that the case was built not on a single revelation, but on a constellation of interconnected details. The timeline that placed Justin inside the home, the fibers that linked him to objects belonging to Victor and Megan, the locked camper accessible only to the adults in the house, the rapid discovery of the body, the inconsistencies in early statements, and the behavioral indicators that suggested foreknowledge rather than shock. These elements were pieces of a mosaic, individually noteworthy, but collectively powerful. Part of what shaped the concluding stage of the narrative was the depth of the community's collective memory. People remembered the morning Justin vanished, the panic that rippled through the neighborhood, and the fearful realization that a child had gone missing along a route measured in footsteps, not miles. They remembered the intense search, coordinated through fields and woodlines, and the sudden end to hope when Justin was found in the cramped compartment of a camper that had already been searched. They remembered the sorrowful funeral that drew more than 200 mourners to Somerville Cemetery, where the tiny casket and the belongings buried with Justin represented the innocence of a life cut brutally short. In the final phase of the investigation and early hearings, prosecutors returned to these elements not as emotional leverage, but as reminders of what had been lost. For them, Justin was not a cold case file. He was a child whose last morning on earth was filled with the simple routines that define a safe home breakfast, morning light, the anticipation of a school day, and whose life was extinguished within minutes of that routine. The forensic evidence indicated that his death occurred between late morning and early afternoon, likely no later than 3 o'clock. This window placed him squarely within the walls of the Turner home at the time of his death. The defense, still clinging to the alternative theory involving Richard Mark Evatt, attempted to raise doubts. They questioned whether a stranger could have slipped through unnoticed, whether the fiber analysis could have been contaminated, and whether emotional inconsistencies in the Turner statements could be interpreted differently. But the prosecution reminded the court that theories must be grounded in evidence, and the evidence presented pointed toward a homicide committed by someone who lived with Justin, not by an external predator. In the final reviews and forensic discussions, experts reaffirmed the significance of the fiber matches. The threads found on Justin's neck and clothing corresponded directly to fibers inside the Turner residence. These were not environmental fibers that could be explained by random contact. They were specific, consistent, and indicative of close physical contact with an object in the home. This detail alone placed Justin inside the house during the fatal event, contradicting early claims that he had walked toward the bus stop that morning. Moreover, the absence of any outdoor material on Justin's shoes or clothing remained one of the most compelling elements of the investigation. Even in the driest conditions, children walking outside collect trace elements: dust, soil, plant matter, pollen. The soles of their shoes reflect their environment. But Justin's clothing showed none of this, reinforcing the conclusion that he never stepped foot outside on the morning he disappeared. This finding aligned seamlessly with the behavior witnessed centuries ago by neighbors who stated they never saw Justin walking to the driveway. It aligned with the evidence that the camper had been searched, yet yielded nothing until Victor entered with uncanny precision. It aligned with the timeline that placed Victor at work during the day, the conflicting statements from Megan, and the heavy implication that Justin's death occurred before the morning bus ever arrived. As the prosecutors concluded their arguments, they emphasized that justice delayed was not justice denied, not if the truth could still be reached. They reminded the court that Justin's mother had devoted the remainder of her life to seeking answers for her son, and even after she passed away, her family continued her fight. Elaine Pace had lived with heartbreak, but she lived with determination too. Her efforts, combined with the advocacy of family members like Amy Parsons, kept the case alive long enough for science to catch up with the truth. Amy's voice echoed across the courtroom, across news interviews, and across social media platforms where she continued to tell Justin's story. She spoke with a clarity and strength born from decades of loss, that Justin was a child who trusted the adults in his life, and that trust was betrayed. That a community suffered because one act of violence shook the foundation of safety people believed they had. That Justin's mother fought for justice until her last breath. And that now, with the truth finally emerging, the family would not rest until accountability was reached. While the legal system continued its careful, deliberate march toward trial, something fundamental had already changed. The Turner case was no longer frozen in time, trapped in the uncertainties of a bygone era. It had moved forward. It had gathered momentum. And though the wheels of justice can turn slowly, they were turning at last. The story of Justin Lee Turner stands as a stark reminder of how fragile life is, how deeply communities can be shaken, and how unrelenting the pursuit of truth can become when a child is lost. It is a story of grief, but also of endurance, of a family that would not give up, of investigators who refused to let the past remain buried, and of a community that remembered a little boy with bright blonde hair and a gentle smile. It is also a story of what happens when time, science, and perseverance converge. More than 3 decades after Justin's disappearance, the renewed investigation brought clarity that was once thought impossible. It tied elements of the case together in ways earlier investigators could not have foreseen. It answered questions that had haunted a family for years, and it illuminated the profound truth that no matter how much time passes, justice remains worth pursuing. The case now stands poised at the culmination of decades of effort. The work of the cold case team, the perseverance of Justin's family, and the advancements in forensic technology have brought the truth into focus. And though the legal process may not yet be concluded, the foundation for justice has been laid more firmly than ever before. In the end, the story returns to where it began: a small child in a rural South Carolina community, beginning what should have been an ordinary morning. A little boy who deserved a long, full life, school days, birthdays, adventures, laughter, and love. Justin's life was taken, but the legacy of those who fought for him stands as a testament to the power of memory, devotion, and the pursuit of truth. And as long as his name is spoken, as long as his story is told, Justin Lee Turner is not forgotten. If you found this documentary valuable and want to support more long-form investigations like this, don't forget to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to join us here at the Criminal Schema, where we continue to uncover the stories that demand to be heard.